The coronavirus, which causes COVID-19, originated in the city of Wuhan, China. COVID-19 is believed to be transmitted primarily through inhalation. Once infected, most people experience mild symptoms, including sore throat, headache, fever, a dry cough, shortness of breath, and fatigue. However, in a subset of patients, the virus attacks the lungs, causing a much more serious infection. Small air sacs in the lungs add oxygen to your blood cells. This oxygen is then transported to organs and tissues throughout the body. When the coronavirus attaches to a cell, it begins to replicate within the cell. The body's immune system attempts to destroy the virus, which results in an inflammatory response that causes fluid accumulation in the lungs. As the lungs fill with fluid, the body's available oxygen decreases, which can lead to organ injury and death. The risk of serious complications increases if a person is elderly or has associated medical conditions. Once infected, a person may show no symptoms but can still infect others. What began in Wuhan has now spread across the globe.
Researchers from China have used cryo-electron microscopy to show how SARS-CoV-2 infects humans. The study published in Science says the virus targets a type of receptor found on human cells in the lungs, heart, kidneys, and intestines. Citing Kingston University microbiologist Mark Fielder, Sky News reports that the virus seems to attack two types of lung cells: goblet cells that coat the respiratory tract with mucus, and ciliated cells that usually filter out pathogens. A previous study published in Science found the virus spike protein has two receptor binding domains, or RBDs, facing downward and another facing upward. These allow the virus to bind with and invade human cells. The virus targets a human ACE2 receptor that has bonded with an amino acid transporter. This subtype of ACE2 structure has never been discovered before. The virus uses the spike protein's up RBD to penetrate the cell. The virus then dissolves its own protein shell and releases its RNA payload inside the cell, according to British Society for Immunology. A study in Frontiers in Microbiology says a coronavirus hijacks the cell's structure to reproduce. The viral RNA takes over the host cell's endoplasmic reticulum to replicate itself and to manufacture the protein parts to make new viruses. According to the Society for Immunology, the hijacked cell's Golgi bodies then package viral RNA and proteins in a viral protein shell. This leads to the creation of new viruses that leave the infected cell via the membrane. The study in Frontiers in Microbiology says coronavirus takeover imposes stress on the host cell. Cell death or apoptosis is the result when the infection overwhelms the host cell's ability to maintain homeostasis.
Microbes are microscopic organisms that we use to bake bread, brew beer, and lately engineer with synthetic DNA to create new biological systems. In this world of synthetic biology, a microbe is seen as a chassis or a structural frame to add genes and DNA. It'll get tested and have its performance improved so it can hopefully do something useful for the world. Yet this potential to modify living organisms and steer them towards global problems is often met with the dark side. It's a swing between promise and total peril, and sometimes called the half-pipe of doom. To understand why this framing exists, we have to go back to the early 2000s. The Human Genome Project was nearing the finish line, and scientists had new molecular tools to dream up promising applications. And a major terrorist attack hit New York City.
There it is. The plane went right through the other tower of the World Trade Center.
In just a week's time, we have had 4 confirmed cases of anthrax, all with media connections, and a number of anthrax scares as well.
At that point, synthetic biology became a potential tool for a whole new kind of weapon.
So when most people think about a bioweapon, they think about some kind of organism. You might think about anthrax bacteria or the smallpox virus, and that is your weapon.
But turning an organism into a lethal pathogen that can do predictable harm requires more sophistication.
Not only do you have to have a pathogen, but then you have to actually know how to reliably hold it, grow it, and then determine ways that you can effectively disseminate it so that the bacteria or toxin wouldn't be destroyed.
After World War I, multiple state governments launched their own biological weapons programs as a research endeavor and stockpiling countermeasure.
And that's probably one of the most top secret pieces of our former bioweapons program, is that formulation of how you keep these things stable to survive as a weapon. These things are living organisms, so they are very finicky. In the Soviet biological weapons program, they tried to create a plague bacteria that was resistant to several different antibiotics. They created this super duper plague weapon, but actually it was a horrible weapon because it would just die. They couldn't have it survive in the environment.
With this focused experimentation, scientists ended up creating enough bioweapons to kill every person on the planet. But luckily, national governments signed a treaty to ban biological weapons. Decades later, huge investments in genetics made the tools and techniques cheaper and more accessible, enough for it to be possible to create an engineered synthetic pathogen. And that's why SynthBio and its quest to make biology easier to engineer set off alarm bells.
In 2002, a group of scientists from the State University of New York at Stony Brook created the first artificial poliovirus synthetically, not using any natural viral components. So that was a real radical innovation. At that time, a congressman picked up the New York Times that day, read about this artificial synthesis of the poliovirus, and really got freaked out. Then a lot of other federal entities got concerned about what happened here. Did we slip up? Should we have done more to have oversight over this?
This poliovirus study was actually funded by DARPA, an agency within the U.S. government.
All this controversy came out as this experiment, a blueprint for bioterrorism. I became very interested in sort of really wondering, is that the case? Like, is it now that easy to create a pathogen from scratch? And I wasn't sure. There's a lot of focus on the materials that the scientists basically could buy commercially to do their experiments, and the fact that they could download information off of the internet. So it wasn't really anything that required highly sophisticated material or equipment.
But there's more to this particular story.
I thought it would be interesting to go and interview the scientists involved. What was really fascinating is once I started kind of probing a little bit about the experiment, they suddenly came to describe this later part, which actually required a significant amount of expertise. Basically, if you couldn't do that part of the experiment would fail. You couldn't actually create the artificial poliovirus. But you wouldn't know that by reading any of the newspaper reports. You wouldn't know that even by reading the scientific paper itself.
And that widely unreported part involved a famous cell line and cow serum.
To make this artificial virus, it actually requires a very rigorous level of purity of these HeLa cell extracts. These HeLa cells are grown in this cow serum. When they've tried to do this experiment using cow serum bought at different times of year, that can actually cause a failure in experiments. They're hypothesizing because they're not really sure, but maybe in these different times of the year, the cows are eating different kinds of things. And that at a very micro level in the cell actually makes a huge difference. From my perspective, I would just like to see more robust kinds of assessments on these technologies instead of the quick jump to go, oh my God, materials, equipment, a garage lab, oh my God, something bad's going to happen. And instead sort of really trying to parse out, okay, what is becoming more easy? What is becoming more difficult? Or what has remained difficult? Because that is the issue. For example, with the poliovirus experiment, that part of the experiment that is difficult is still difficult today. Nothing over 18 years, nothing has changed to make that easier.
So expertise is really key here. But even the experts understand that there are legitimate security vulnerabilities with a rapidly advancing field like synthetic biology. The National Academies of Science released a major report on it with a ranked list of threat concerns. High on the list is recreating known pathogenic viruses and making existing bacteria more dangerous. Lowest is modifying the human genome with gene drives. Some suggestions in the report involve developing detection tools and computational approaches that can better screen for any rogue engineered organisms. And this is exactly what Ginkgo Bioworks, a synthetic organism factory, is working on.
The goal of the Felix program is to determine whether a piece of DNA, a sequence of DNA on a computer, is genetically engineered or not. IARPA has funded many different performers across the US to take a crack at this problem when we're all taking very, very different approaches. You can slice these kind of signatures of engineering in a number of different ways. So some organisms are 80% AT, some are 80% GC. What this means is that if you take the DNA from different organisms and glue them together, and you're counting, the A's, C's, T's, and G's, eventually, if you're looking at DNA that's been glued together from disparate sources, you'll see some major swing in those statistics.
To investigate these signatures, they're pooling together data from their own experiments into this massive database for algorithms to then do what they do best.
So we've developed AIs that can manipulate all these different styles of genetic engineering and generate the data for us.
So far, they've simulated 5 million synthetic genomes as a training ground for these machine learning algorithms.
The main goal here is to build up a biosecurity sector along with the advance of genetic engineering so that, unlike in the case of cybersecurity, we're ready when threats actually emerge.
It's a smart way to get out front on the issue by leveraging the field's advanced tools and techniques as part of the security solution.
We're quizzed and tested regularly with blind samples. There are a number of testing and evaluation teams which come out of the national labs, and they are genetically engineering organisms in their laboratories, sequencing them, and sending us blinded samples of all kinds of weird natural organisms as well as genetically engineered organisms. This happens about every 7 or 8 months, and we have to report back to them which data sets have been engineered and which ones haven't.
Initiatives like this will continue to take shape as an industry forms around synthetic biology, because the technology needed to recreate and remix DNA sequences is here, and resurrecting extinct viruses in synthetic form to search for new medical therapies is part of the field's own evolution. The 2002 poliovirus might have been the first synthetic virus, but it won't be the last.
There are so many laboratories worldwide that use materials and equipment for basic academic research, for positive, beneficial industry-related research, for clinical applications. There's not an easy point in the life sciences where you can say, well, this is weapons and it's bad, and this is research and applications and it's good.
And this duality goes straight to the heart of the field, to the microbes themselves. There are millions of them in our world with dual use. Some can make us dangerously sick, and some can fight disease. It's a wide continuum presented to us by nature itself, and it's ultimately up to us to navigate through.
China covered up the coronavirus at a time when millions were traveling. And there's a war between Thailand and China, a meme war. That and more on this week's China News Headlines. This is China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. Guess what? According to internal government documents leaked to the Associated Press, the Chinese Communist Party knew before January 14th that they had a deadly epidemic on their hands, and they didn't warn the public for 6 days. Now let me clarify. I'm not talking about small-time local officials in Wuhan where the coronavirus outbreak began. I'm talking about the very top level of the Chinese Communist Party. On January 14th, the National Health Commission held a teleconference with provincial health authorities. The teleconference was held to convey instructions on the coronavirus from President Xi Jinping, Premier Li Keqiang, and Vice Premier Sun Chunlan. So yeah, Xi Jinping and other top leaders knew before January 14th, but Xi didn't warn the public about the epidemic until January 20th. During that time, Communist authorities allowed officials in Wuhan, the epicenter of the disease they knew about, to hold a mass banquet for tens of thousands of people while millions began traveling through for Lunar New Year celebrations. even though an internal government memo from January 14th said that with the coming of the Spring Festival, many people will be traveling and the risk of transmission and spread is high. All localities must prepare for and respond to a pandemic. Meanwhile, Chinese health officials were telling the public they weren't likely to get infected by other people.
At present, we have reached the latest understanding that the risk of sustained human-to-human transmission is low.
So privately, officials were saying that the risk of transmission and spread was high, while publicly saying it was low. And the World Health Organization helped the Communist Party cover it up by tweeting, "Chinese authorities have found no clear evidence of human-to-human transmission." Meanwhile, inside China, where doctors were seeing human-to-human transmission, those who tried to raise a warning were ignored and, at worst, crushed. Doctors in Wuhan were afraid. It was truly intimidation of an entire profession. So why did the party let thousands of people get sick while they tried to keep it quiet? According to that government memo from January 14th, authorities were worried about political stability. The memo demanded officials unite around Xi and made clear that political considerations and social stability were key priorities during the long lead up to China's two biggest political meetings of the year in March, which it turns out they had to cancel anyway because they let the coronavirus become a pandemic. That's called stupid with Chinese characteristics. So the Chinese Communist Party let the coronavirus spread around China and the world because they didn't want to lose their grip on power, which is why the coronavirus is truly the CCP virus. But there's one group the Chinese Communist Party can't seem to intimidate: meme creators, at least the ones in Thailand. A famous Thai actor who goes by the name Bright retweeted a photo of Hong Kong last week that referred to it as a country. His Chinese fans were very upset, and he later posted an apology. And peace was restored to the internet for one hot second. Then his girlfriend, who calls herself New, retweeted a popular COVID-19 conspiracy theory that China invented the virus in a lab in Wuhan. Uh-oh. Chinese netizens then found this old exchange between the two. Basically, it was a photo of New in Taiwan, and Bright said she looked like a cute Chinese girl. She corrected him, cute Taiwanese girl. And a meme war began. My favorite Chinese state-run media, the Global Times, decided it was their job to jump into the Twitter dumpster fire. They published a hit piece on Bright's newest TV show, basically suggesting that Chinese people boycott it. An army of Chinese nationalists also made their way to Twitter, which is blocked in China, to demand a public apology from New. Now normally, this kind of onslaught is enough to make even the biggest, most powerful corporations in the world crack. Like that time Mercedes-Benz pathetically apologized to China after an Instagram post quoting the Dalai Lama. But in Thailand, Thai trolls showed they could go toe-to-toe with China's Wu Mao, the 50 Cent army, who get paid to post pro-Communist Party messaging on the internet. Here are some of my favorites. But perhaps most impressive is the Virgin Wu Mao and the Chad Thai, which just shows you the might of the Thai people. You see, Chad Thais don't care when the Wu Mao criticize the Thai government because Chad Thais also criticize their own government. But it didn't even stop there. Now, Hong Kong and Taiwan are joining forces with Thailand to further burn the Chinese Communist Party. A Taiwanese mayor said, "Thank you, our friends from Thailand. Thailand has long been a popular travel destination for the Taiwanese. We look forward to increased exchanges after the COVID-19 outbreak." Hong Kong protest leader Joshua Wong called for an alliance between Hong Kongers and Taiwanese to support Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam to fight Chinese environmental destruction. Some are calling it the Milk Tea Alliance. And can I just say, after months covering a deadly pandemic, It's nice to finally have a story bring a smile to my face. You know, I'm not putting that thing away, because get a load of this next story. The Chinese Communist Party has asked the Wisconsin State Senate to praise them. Wisconsin Senate President Roger Roth received 2 emails from Chinese consulate staff asking that he pass a resolution they wrote supporting China's battle against COVID-19, praising China's response to the virus. Here's the resolution that the Chinese consulate wrote. You might recognize some familiar propaganda, like the idea that China was transparent and quick in sharing key information, thus creating a window of opportunity for other countries. What did Roth do? He put together his own resolution. It starts out by acknowledging that the Communist Party of China deliberately and intentionally misled the world on the Wuhan coronavirus, and by standing in solidarity with the Chinese people to condemn the actions of the Communist Party of China. Along the way, he manages to work in references to the Communist Party's human rights abuses, including Tibet, Uyghur concentration camps, forced abortions and sterilizations, forced organ harvesting, the Tiananmen Square massacre, and religious persecution. He's not quite a Thai memer, but I gotta say, I like the guy. Going against the Chinese Communist Party seems to be getting trendy. Here's Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi talking about the teleconferencing app Zoom.
Zoom is a Chinese entity.
That comes after reports that Zoom might have quite a few security flaws. So when you're using Zoom, be careful not to share your credit card information or your anti-CCP political views. Meanwhile, the UK newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, has said it will stop publishing propaganda paid for by China. It's a section called China Watch. They had been running it about once a month for more than a decade. It blends into all the other articles in a paper, but is actually written by the Chinese propaganda department. American papers have also run China Watch, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. The Telegraph was allegedly paid more than $1 million a year to do it, which is to say, here, I'm showing China Watch on my show, where's my money? McDonald's China Corporation has apologized after a local franchise banned black people. This is the notice posted at that McDonald's in Guangzhou. It's part of a much larger wave of racism against Africans inside China. For more, check out the recent episode, China's Racist Attacks on Black Foreigners. The weird thing is, many people are telling us that they didn't get a YouTube notification about this episode. So if you haven't seen it, check it out. Of course, China's attacks against foreigners happened after weeks of the Chinese Communist Party calling any criticism of the party and how it handled the coronavirus racist. And in another move without any trace of irony, the Chinese embassy in Sri Lanka called for freedom of speech after its Twitter account got suspended. Twitter said it was a systematic mistake, not anything personal. The embassy said it regretted this systematic mistake and wanted to reiterate that freedom of speech must be honored. Yes, the Chinese Communist Party is talking about how important freedom of speech is on Twitter, which is banned in China.
This particular video is about the scientific corruption that you as the public must realize. I'm going to present the information to you and let you decide whether it constitutes corruption or not. You be the ultimate judge. This was orchestrated. We have the scientific evidence from 2015 showing that the research was done, the gain of function components were done by the scientists in North Carolina that then went back to Wuhan. The US government and the Chinese government paid Dr. Shi to fund research in. There's an underlying implication here that's very subtle, but the only possible reason for this modification is the creation of. There are no other plausible explanations. Now that sounds a little far-fetched, I agree, but wait, you're going to understand. Because when you start understanding this furin cleavage component that we're talking about, then it starts to make a little bit of sense. But why would somebody do that? Or how can we prove that somebody actually did that? So we're going to talk about that. Now, this was actually created at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and they published the highlights of the creation in November 2015. In 2014, Dr. Shi was the recipient of a number of U.S. government grants, as well as grants from the National Basics Research Program of China, the Chinese Academy of Science, the National Natural Science Foundation of China, and from the Strategic Priority Research Program of Chinese Academy of Sciences to assist in funding research into. Now, this is, remember, 2015. So they took SARS, the virus that caused SARS in 2002, 2003, and that was carried by bats, making the rounds back in 2003, and reverse engineered the genetic coding itself inside the virus. And they took the backbone of the original wild type, and that's when they started messing around with it. They then inserted additional proteins to enhance the efficacy of the virus inside the human lungs, specifically inside for the human aspect, making it extremely difficult to vaccinate against because the new virus has multiple proteins with which to attack. So basically what they did was they made a bug into a super virus. Let's hold off, let's not panic, because what I want to show here is how the scientific community that knew about this, and yet they're sitting here making stuff. Why are they making this? Why are they doing gain of function? Why is University of North Carolina involved with this? Why are we funding? Why is the US government funding this research on something that we thought had already disappeared? Why are they trying to get gain of function? You know, some people would say, well, they were just experimenting, they were doing whatever, but they were actual other scientists that opposed this information. They did not want these studies to be done because they were afraid of a breakout. They were afraid of what the ramification would be if there was an outbreak, if the was not contained. So this was not something that was obscure. There were some very well-known people that were against this. What would be the purpose of doing such a thing? Well, it'll become self-evident here in a few moments. This is going on from 2003 to 2015 now. They were looking at the SARS component from 2003, that caused SARS, and they were now manipulating that, and they published this manipulation study. After they manipulated it, they published it in this 2015 paper, and they created this hybrid, which is far more deadly and can't be vaccinated against. It is resistant to vaccination because of certain morphological changes that were created to the wild type backbone. The new DNA, genetically engineered, constitutes a gain in pathogenesis. Now I want you to remember what gain in pathogenesis means, okay? Or gain of function is the term that they use in virology, or actually in research. So gain of function. Okay, here it is. That's a gain of function right there. They admit it. Gain of function basically means taking something and making it more potent, all right? So pathogenesis means lethalness and the infectiousness of something. The pathogenesis is the cause of the actual problem, cause of the disease. And Dr. Shi learns how to perform gain of function operations within viruses, and then she returns to her post in Wuhan, China. So she learned this in University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. They get the cells from Fort Detrick, and now she goes back to Wuhan, which is where the techniques that she learned about gain of function were then applied. Fast forward to November 2019, a breach of containment occurs at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and patient 0 is detected somewhere between December 1st and December 12th. Dr. Shi is one of the authors that published this paper in January 23rd, 2020, stating that it is of probable bat origin. The problem is she knows what it is and what the origin is because she was the one who created it, okay? She helped to enhance it. This is an enhanced version of the hybrid that they helped develop at UNC with Fort Detrick support back in 2015. Why would you take any kind of organism and make it more potent? Why would you take a bug, a bacteria, and make it more potent, right? What's the purpose of that? Well, they say it's for research purposes. But why would you do research to make something more potent? Why wouldn't you do research to make something that's not that bad anyway, less damaging, but they're making it more potent? They're doing gain of function studies. This is a gain of function study on, this is what created it. This is a gain of function study that was done on a specific strain of called the SHC014 strain. Scientific review panels may deem similar studies building chimeric based on circulating strains too risky to pursue. Yeah, no, it's just amazing to me that this has been happening. Studies testing hybrid in human cell cultures and animal models are limited in what they can say about the posed by wild. Daszak agrees, but he argues that they can help indicate which pathogens should be prioritized for further research attention. Now that's the most absurd statement, because they're saying, okay, it should be limited, but you know what? It can help us to prioritize further research. So we need to make these superbugs so then we can then warrant our research to go and look at these superbugs and how they affect the human system. How about doing something even a little bit more effective and not create the damn superbug in the first place? Like, you really need to create a superbug and then try to see how it should be prioritized, so they can help indicate which pathogens should be prioritized for further research? I mean, that's the most absurd thing to say. We're going to take a bunch of different and then we're going to see which ones we can create the most potent chimeric changes to, and then once we create this chimera, then we'll go ahead and it'll warrant our priority to which we should really work on, focus in on. Well, don't create these super bugs in the first damn place, and you won't have to worry about which one you need to prioritize. Bobby Kennedy said that there were 3 countries that are naturally hostile to each other, which is China, Taiwan, and Japan, and all 3 of them independently concluded that it originated in the United States. Yes, they did. I just showed you the evidence of that. Now, Trump reportedly growing frustrated with Dr. Fauci's blunt approach. I wonder why. Because Trump knows certain things. He knows what's happening here based upon, you can see his cavalier approach. But essentially, he's the one who's out there saying, whipping up the story about the China bats. The government in the United States and China funded it. And then this Dr. Shi went back to Wuhan, and then of course it got released, or there was an outbreak in Wuhan. But where did it all start? It started here in the United States, in North Carolina. So here's something that was posted today, just a couple hours ago, from a TV station, I believe KSAT. Breaking news, first related reported in San Antonio. Now here's the kicker. This is the family member, Ashley Zara Farrell, off that person. It says KSAT 12 and KSAT.com. I must say I'm highly disappointed at your lack of facts. My grandmother did not pass away at San Antonio MMC. She passed away at a local inpatient hospice facility. Remember, hospice is for people that are terminal, that are going. She did not pass away from, she passed away from Alzheimer's that she had suffered from for the past 12 years, and a case of aspiration pneumonia that worsened her ailing state. Shame on you, KSAT. Again, the media is hyping this crap and scaring people. They're not reporting the facts. They're not reporting the truth. They're lying. Now, there's a lot of people talking about the misinformation and then saying it's misinformation, it's controversial, but they're not really looking at the science. I want you to remember that this is not the first time this has happened. This was Lyme's disease in the 1990s, SARS in 2002, XMRV in 2009, MERS in 2012, Ebola in 2014, and Zika in 2016, actually H1N1 in 2010. I just want people to know that the agenda is highly, highly suspect. Be aware, don't be paralyzed by fear, because this is part and parcel of their agenda. All right, there's 7 toxicities according to my philosophy, and they have hit 6 of the 7 toxicities. The 5th toxicity being emotional, psychological. That's what they've done with this hype, by creating the hype, by creating the fear mongering. That is affecting people on an emotional, psychological level. I know this was a long video. I hope you understand the significance of this. Pay it forward, pass it on, let people know the truth.
Let's get you the latest figures that have been put out by the government on the number of cases of coronavirus in the country. It's now reached 26,917. The death toll also unfortunately has risen to 800. 126. We're also breaking down the state-wise data for you. Maharashtra has the most number of cases in the country with 7,628. 323 deaths have also been reported in Maharashtra so far. Gujarat also has seen a spike in the number of COVID-19 cases. It's now got 3,071 cases of coronavirus, 133 deaths so far in Gujarat. In Delhi, the number of cases stands at 2,625. 54 deaths have been reported so far in the national capital. Those are the latest numbers as of 6:30 this morning.
Did the coronavirus pandemic begin in a Chinese lab? The U.S. investigates. This is China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. Did the coronavirus begin in a Chinese lab? The ongoing saga of the coronavirus, what I call the CCP virus, has taken a new twist. The U.S. is now investigating the possibility that the virus actually began in a Chinese government laboratory in Wuhan, not in a wet market.
At the start of the outbreak, this is where China directed the world's attention, suggesting that this Wuhan seafood market was the source of the novel coronavirus outbreak. U.S. intelligence officials tell CNN they are investigating another possible source, suggesting the virus may not have originated naturally as China has advertised, but rather that it possibly started in a Wuhan lab.
Okay, it's kind of an old twist. People have been talking about whether the coronavirus came from a lab since the CCP virus outbreak began. And it's often been dismissed as a conspiracy theory. But once in a while, conspiracy theories are true. In other words, they end up being investigative reporting, if you do the investigating part. It's not impossible for a virus to leak from a lab. In fact, small SARS outbreaks after the original one were caused by lab leaks in Beijing. But it's been harder to nail down whether this new coronavirus could have leaked from a lab. President Trump was asked about the Wuhan lab theory at a recent press conference, and Trump displayed his usual art of subtlety.
Have U.S. intelligence analysts told you that they think that the virus escaped from a Chinese research lab, that it was an...
Well, I can't tell you that. Have U.S. intelligence agents told me? I mean, what kind of a question is that?
Do you feel...
I can't. Do you want me to tell you? Let me tell you what they told me. Look, they told me plenty. They told me plenty.
The lab in Wuhan, called the Wuhan Institute of Virology, obviously denies the accusation. In an interview with Chinese state-run media, the director of the lab said there is absolutely no way that the virus originated from our institute. Incidentally, the director of the lab is also the secretary of the lab's Communist Party committee. And it makes sense that the highest ranking person in the lab would also head the lab's Communist Party committee. But when was the last time the Chinese Communist Party lied to us about the coronavirus? Anyway, the World Health Organization is backing up China's story, saying the coronavirus came from an animal, not a lab. And when was the last time the WHO lied to us about the coronavirus? Of course, the WHO was wrong, but that's just because they believe the Chinese Communist Party. I see a problem here. Back to the virus. Originally, it was thought to come from this wet market, but apparently, there's no evidence the market sold bats or pangolins, the animals from which the virus is thought to have jumped to humans. And the bat species that carries it isn't found within 100 miles of Wuhan. So there's a potential hole in the wet market theory. And in 2018, U.S. diplomats in China who visited the Wuhan Institute of Virology warned of a serious shortage of appropriately trained technicians and investigators needed to safely operate this high-containment laboratory. And some of the Chinese Communist Party's actions are a bit suspicious. Well, okay, I need to narrow that down. How the party treated this specific lab in Wuhan was suspicious. In January, the Chinese military posted its top epidemiologist to the Wuhan lab. In February, Chinese leader Xi Jinping began talking about biosafety reforms in labs. That's an odd response to a coronavirus that supposedly came from a wet market. And as the U.S. began to investigate the origin of the coronavirus, the Communist Party began to heavily censor academic research about the origin of the virus. I mean, science and public health are always best served when communist officials are looking over scientists' work. Of course, if the coronavirus didn't begin in a lab, the Communist Party could clear its name by having outside scientists come look at the Wuhan lab and set the record straight. But, according to U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, China is not allowing that.
We know that they've not permitted the world's scientists to go into that laboratory to evaluate what took place there, what's happening there, even as we speak.
And it's no longer just the U.S. investigating if the coronavirus leaked from a lab. The U.K. is also looking into it. So is Australia. By the way, to make things even more confusing, there's another lab in Wuhan where a coronavirus could have leaked. It's the Wuhan CDC lab, and it's less than half a mile from the wet market. It doesn't get as much attention because it's only a level 2 biosafety lab and not a level 4 lab like the Wuhan Institute of Virology. However, the Wuhan CDC lab was definitely studying bat viruses, as we can see from this Chinese documentary from December 2019. Wow, that was pretty intense. I bet they regret making that documentary. Now, to be clear, the US is not saying the CCP virus was man-made or an engineered biological weapon. Just because one of these labs may have been doing risky experiments on bat coronaviruses does not mean they were trying to make a bioweapon. And obviously, an uncontrollable coronavirus would be the world's stupidest bioweapon. And US officials noted that the intelligence community is also exploring a range of other theories regarding the origination of the virus. So they're not just looking into the lab leak theory, but they are also investigating to see if the virus may have accidentally leaked from a lab, which has a checkered history of safety problems. American embassy officials in Beijing made several visits to the research facility and sent 2 official warnings back to Washington in early 2018 about the lab's inadequate safety measures. This was at a time when researchers were conducting risky studies on coronaviruses from bats. So what do you get when you combine risky laboratory research with inadequate safety measures? An epidemic that totally came from a wet market. And if you say otherwise, you're a crazy conspiracist. The Chinese Communist Party covered up the coronavirus, but they had no choice. That's just how their system works. And now people are dying. Close to 200,000 people around the world have died from the coronavirus. And it originally spread because the Chinese Communist Party covered it up during the very early stages. That's why I've been calling it the CCP virus. If the CCP had properly handled it better in the first 2 months, a lot of lives would have been saved. But the cover-up was a symptom of a much deeper problem. That is, the entire structure and MO of the Communist Party, from top to bottom, encourages this exact type of cover-up. The problem lies in the one-party system. The Chinese Communist Party tries to be all-powerful. It exercises extreme control over every aspect of its citizens' lives, from what they can see on social media to even how many children they can have. In this type of system, the party takes all the credit when things go well, but it should also bear all the blame when things go badly. With great power comes great responsibility. Except the party is the opposite of Spider-Man, because it wants to have all the power and not take any responsibility, especially when things go wrong. That's why the party is obsessed with stability. The government is constantly talking about stability maintenance, which is coded language for ensuring the party's rule. Since 2011, the Chinese government's internal security budget, which is also known as their stability maintenance budget, has been larger than their military budget. So the Communist Party considers any threat to stability as a threat to their rule. You know what's a threat to stability? A deadly epidemic. So when it came down to it, the Communist Party put stability ahead of helping sick citizens. It's just what they do. For example, the Chinese Communist Party still claims that the 2003 SARS epidemic struck suddenly and they had no time to prepare. In reality, the first cases happened in Guangdong province in late November 2002. Chinese officials didn't inform the World Health Organization about SARS until February 2003. And when it started to spread to other regions of China, they covered that up too. Officially, SARS killed just under 800 people in China. But in reality, it may have been several thousand more than that because of the cover-up. This is Dr. Jiang Yanyong. In April 2003, he wrote a letter exposing the true number of SARS patients in Beijing, which was several times higher than the official number. His letter was publicized by Western media. The party was forced to respond. They fired several Beijing officials, and they put Dr. Jiang under surveillance. And to this day, the Communist Party has still not admitted there was a SARS cover-up. But afterwards, the Chinese Communist Party did create what was supposed to be a fail-safe system to track contagions. It failed. The system they put in place focused on having doctors across China put patient data into a centralized database. This way, central authorities could monitor if there are any new outbreaks. It works great, at least in theory. Last July, 8,000 Chinese health officials even conducted a massive online drill focusing on how to handle an infectious disease outbreak in the style of SARS. The officials raced to test how quickly and effectively they could track, identify, and contain the virus, including by notifying Beijing. It worked in the simulation, but as we've seen over the last few months, it did not work in reality. That's because the Chinese Communist Party's political apparatus makes it impossible for even the best designed system to function properly. After doctors in Wuhan began treating clusters of patients stricken with a mysterious pneumonia in December, the reporting was supposed to have been automatic. Instead, hospitals deferred to local health officials who, over a political aversion to sharing bad news, withheld information about cases from the national reporting system, keeping Beijing in the dark and delaying the response. So, the official system failed. And when doctors tried to share information through unofficial channels, like Dr. Li Wenliang, they were accused of spreading rumors. Police eventually forced Dr. Li to sign this statement admitting to illegal behavior, including publishing untrue discourse on the internet. You see, because of the party's top-down system, any unofficial information is dangerous. Rumors are a threat to stability. Anyone who speaks out is a troublemaker, like Dr. Jiang during SARS or Dr. Li during the CCP virus. 3 weeks after Dr. Li's warning, Wuhan should have looked like this, with authorities diligently preparing for the worst. Instead, it looked like this, as local authorities held a massive potluck banquet for 10,000 families on January 19th, nearly 3 weeks after Dr. Li Wenliang tried to warn people. See, it didn't matter how advanced China's outbreak reporting mechanisms were if no one reports anything. Hospital officials didn't want to get in trouble with local officials. Local officials didn't want to get in trouble with Beijing. The Chinese Communist Party itself can never be wrong, so whenever something goes wrong in China, lower-level officials become the scapegoat, which means they're afraid to do anything. Everything's fine in Wuhan, there's no epidemic here. Of course, when it turns out there is an epidemic, local officials get fired anyway. Another problem with the Communist Party's centralized control is that they can't let anybody else help during a disaster, like civil society groups, churches, or nonprofits, or in other words, its own people. Even the Red Cross Society of China is controlled by the government. It's also notoriously corrupt. The party also doesn't want outside experts to help. So when experts from the US Centers for Disease Control and the World Health Organization offered to help China, they were ignored for weeks. Meanwhile, Chinese state-run media repeatedly published articles in mid-January claiming the virus was preventable and controllable. And then, Chinese authorities shut down the laboratory that first shared the coronavirus genome with the world for political rectification. So this wasn't just a mistake by a few local officials. The Chinese Communist Party itself, from top to bottom, was involved in the cover-up. The Chinese communist system is corrupt. This report by the Associated Press says that top leaders, including Xi Jinping, knew that China was facing a serious pandemic in mid-January, but did not disclose the extent of it to the public for 6 days. In those 6 days, at least 3,000 people got infected, and that was enough to allow the coronavirus to spread out of control. On a government teleconference on January 14th, the head of China's National Health Commission, Ma Xiaowei, said that the epidemic situation is still severe and complex, the most severe challenge since SARS in 2003, and is likely to develop into a major public health event. Now, you might think the implication here is, okay, it's time to warn the public and stop this thing before it spreads further. But instead, in the memo, Ma demanded officials unite around Xi Jinping and made clear that political considerations and social stability were key priorities during the long lead up to China's two biggest political meetings of the year in March. So basically, China's top health official said that political considerations and stability were more important than alerting the public. Not that it helped, since the CCP had to cancel those two big political meetings anyway because of the coronavirus. Ironically, the cancellation was as a direct result of the CCP emphasizing their political considerations. The Chinese communist system rewards cover-ups and punishes truth. This isn't a new thing. When millions of people starved to death during the so-called Great Leap Forward of the 1950s, local officials who lied and told Mao Zedong that everything was great got promoted. Especially the liar who told Mao that hat looks great. In the late 90s, the governor of Henan province, this guy, helped cover up a massive AIDS epidemic. Thousands of farmers got HIV through a botched government blood plasma program. Did he get punished? No, he got promoted. Now he's the second highest ranking member of the Communist Party, where he's in a great position to lie to World Health authorities. In Communist China, people who are skilled at lying and covering things up rise through the ranks. People who insist on telling the truth typically don't make it very far. Individuals in China who tell the truth are often flat out punished, like Dr. Li Wenliang, or they're sent to jail, or even forced to make confessions on state-run television. So it's only natural that when a deadly virus spreads, the Communist Party's first reaction is to cover it up. And it's not like they've learned their lesson this time. US intelligence says the Chinese Communist Party is still covering up how many people are dying from the coronavirus. So when some media suggests that China's virus strategy could be a model for the rest of the world, or that it makes China's model look better and better, they must think that the Chinese Communist Party's 90-year track record of lying and covering things up is somehow over. Pro tip, it's not over. Although, according to the Chinese Communist Party, there's never been a cover-up of the coronavirus outbreak. So we're at the point where they're covering up the cover-up. A wave of xenophobia and racism is sweeping China. Africans are being targeted and forced onto the streets. Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. When the Chinese Communist Party unleashed the deadly coronavirus pandemic upon the world, do you remember what their response was? Calling the US racist for saying it started in China. Chinese media wrote that some American officials, including Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, are using Wuhan virus, which is considered a racist term. Thank you, Global Times. You truly are my favorite state-run media. Yes, according to the Global Times, anyone who says Wuhan virus is racist, which includes, plot twist, the Global Times. I mean, that's why I started calling it the CCP virus. I'm not racist. In fact, party mouthpiece Xinhua said racism is actually worse than the coronavirus. Back in February, Chinese state-run media was saying the US travel ban on people who had recently been in China was an anti-China action, and all countries should lift travel restrictions. Fast forward to the end of March, and China put in place its own travel ban, one that's way more restrictive than anything the US did. Because for China, it doesn't matter which country you've recently been in, as long as you're ethnically a foreigner, China has now banned you from entering the country. You might think that's hypocritical, but you see, it isn't. When the Chinese government uses travel restrictions to stop the spread of the coronavirus they caused, that's necessary. When the US does it to stop the spread of the coronavirus the Chinese government caused, that's racist. When they do it, it's fine. When America does it, it's racist, obviously. In a recent Foreign Ministry press briefing, a reporter from state-run Xinhua News asked, there have been reports of some foreigners complaining about discrimination and rising xenophobia in China. Do you have any comment? And the Foreign Ministry spokesman said, China opposes all forms of discrimination and prejudice. Cue the racial purge.
A large number of African people in the southern Chinese city Guangzhou were driven out by their landlords and had to stay on the streets. Another video shows many Africans dragging their luggage aimlessly through the streets of Guangzhou. One of them says, "We are just walking on the road. They can't give us a house, they can't give us a hotel, and they cannot provide a place we can stay."
And how did the Chinese authorities respond to a bunch of evicted Africans walking down the street? By sending the police to follow and harass them. There are even reports of authorities taking away their passports. There is literally nowhere for these people to go.
Nigerians in China are suffering. They are suffering well. Nigerians in China. Child. It's a pity, it's a pity, it's a pity. Nigeria in China is suffering. It's a pity. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God.
Now, while there are definitely examples of people in America being xenophobic against Chinese people,
every disease has ever came from China. It's f***ing disgusting.
What's happening in Guangzhou is racial discrimination by the government itself.
Huddled on cobbled streets with layers of clothing to generate heat under the cold skies of Guangzhou city, this is the new way of life for Africans living in China. Africans have become subjects of racial profiling. Chinese nationals blame them for the rising number of new coronavirus cases in the country.
Although it's not limited to the government either. A McDonald's franchise in Guangzhou posted this notice saying that black people are not allowed to enter the restaurant. McDonald's Corporation was not happy about what that franchise owner did, and they shut them down temporarily. Now, it is true that in the Guangzhou district known as Little Africa, 16 people have tested positive for the CCP virus. But 16? That's not a lot. More cases might come to light, but the reason there's a second wave of the coronavirus in China is because of the Chinese Communist Party's continued cover-up and forcing people to go back to work. It's not because of a small number of African immigrants, no matter how much they try to blame it on them. For more on that, check out our episode, China May See a Second Wave of Infections. There are now instances of what Chinese authorities are calling imported cases of the coronavirus. But 90% of those were Chinese passport holders returning to China, according to China's foreign ministry. Despite facts, there's been reports of more and more anti-foreigner sentiment in China, particularly against black people who are seen as diseased rapists.
国内目前的外国人给大家的印象并不是很好，像新闻总会爆出来很多黑人强奸啊这种事件。我不是针对这一个种族。
嗰啲客人呢，玩咗嗰個女仔，個女仔有艾滋病，佢又玩咗另一個女大學生，個女大學生又有艾滋病。
This is not too surprising in a country where there's a commercial of a Chinese woman washing a black man with such a powerful laundry detergent that he becomes Chinese. Here are particularly classy comments from Weibo, the Chinese version of Twitter. Blacks are the most inferior race. I don't even know why people see them as humans. Can our country expel the blacks? Yes, I'm racist. They're ugly and have no quality. No matter what race, black or white, Chinese are superior. Wrong is wrong. We won't discriminate and look down on others. Wow! The Chinese version of Twitter is even more of a dumpster fire than regular Twitter. But these are just comments and actions from individuals. And there are racist people in every country, especially internet country. But in China, instead of there being laws to protect people against racist policies or attacks, the Chinese Communist Party and the government are totally cool with it. They actually create racist policies. For example, black residents in Guangzhou are being forced to remain inside their apartments even if they have not traveled anywhere that would warrant a quarantine and submit to coronavirus tests. It's not about where you've been, it's about what you look like. Chinese authorities did the same thing back in 2009 during the swine flu outbreak that started in Mexico. China was quarantining all Mexicans even if they hadn't been to Mexico. Sure, it's racist, but at least Chinese authorities are consistent. Xenophobic attitudes are only getting worse as the Chinese Communist Party tries to blame the coronavirus on foreigners. Throughout China, there are reports of businesses closing their doors to foreign friends. Though, hashtag not all Chinese. Here's a woman slamming authorities for, as they say, just following orders.
全部黑人隔离，全部黑人隔离，华人呢？白人呢？为什么你们不隔离他们呀？你们换位思考一下，我们中国同胞也有在国外的，也有在非洲的。如果这个事情传出去，你想我们的同胞在那边会怎么样？你们有想没想过这个问题？已经讲。我知道哈，你们是按章办事，这个我很理解。我们都是按照上级的要求来做的。
We're just doing our job. There's an argument that has never been used to justify anything bad before. But that woman was right. The Chinese Communist Party has been investing heavily in Africa as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, or as it's been called, colonialism with Chinese characteristics. Many African leaders have been eager to get Chinese money for their countries, or for themselves and their cronies. But this persecution of African nationals inside China is putting the Communist Party's Africa plans in jeopardy. A Nigerian official confronted their Chinese ambassador about it. So did the president of the African Union, who is probably already a little upset at the Chinese Communist Party for that time they spied on the African Union for 5 years. In response to these complaints from African nations, Chinese diplomats denied everything. And now that this issue has become a major diplomatic mess for the Chinese Communist Party, they're promising equal treatment for Africans. But in a country where just 3 months ago, Chinese media denied the coronavirus could be spread human to human, there's only one thing you can trust. The Chinese officials are lying.